Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Methuselah Paradox, a Technothriller, by T.R. Harris, narrated by T.J. Clark. Prologue. Alexandria, Virginia, 4 months ago. Ben Peterson's worst nightmare was coming true. 70 innocent people, dead. And this was just the beginning. This was horrible. And it was all Ben's fault. "Get away from there!" he yelled at the other man in the room. "Those are my files!" "That's where you're wrong, Doctor," the man responded, a tinge of malicious glee in his voice. "Everything in here belongs to Monroe Pharmaceuticals, including you." "How could you let him do that? Kill all those people?" Ben demanded. "Because he's a great man, with an even greater vision of the future," Colin McAuliffe replied. "Are you going to kill me now?" Ben's voice trembled with fear and anger. McAuliffe laughed. "Not hardly, Doctor." He continued to rifle through Ben's computer before deciding it was easier just to take the whole thing rather than select files. He knelt and began unhooking the tower. "You're too important. There's still a lot for you to do. But if you betray Mr. Monroe, then trust me when I say it, I will kill you, and without a second thought." McAuliffe lifted the computer tower and set it on Ben's desk. He glanced back at the scientist, shaking his head, before looking around the room for more data files. "Did you really think your little act was fooling anyone?" McAuliffe asked with a laugh. "You nearly passed out when you saw the video. Sure, you tried to hide your shock, but both Mr. Monroe and I saw through it. But good job trying to hide it with your 'that was a good test' comment. You deserve an Oscar for that performance." In a panic, Ben rushed the younger man, placing his hands aggressively on his shoulders, trying to keep him from rummaging through the laboratory and stealing Ben's work. McAuliffe effortlessly shoved him away, sending Ben crashing into a nearby lab bench. His flailing arms sent equipment scattering across the metal surface and shattering a tray of test tubes. Then Ben's hand fell upon something familiar, a 1,000 microliter pipette. As rage took over, his fist closed on the 12-inch-long, pointed sampling tool. At the sound of glass breaking and metal scraping on metal, McAuliffe turned toward Ben. The scientist didn't know what he expected at that moment. Perhaps to injure the man with the pipette, get him to back away from the computer, or maybe just to scare him. But what he wasn't expecting was for his thrusting fist to send the pointed end of the pipette into McAuliffe's left eye socket, and for the force of the thrust to propel the sampling tube deep into his brain, stopping only when the glass tip reached the hardened back of the skull. With a sudden gasp, Ben released the makeshift weapon and staggered back, his breath coming in fits as he scanned the blank look on McAuliffe's face. The man didn't scream out. His brain was too damaged for that. Instead, he fell, first to his knees, and then backward, lying prone on the floor, with the blue-handled lab tool still in his eye socket. Colin McAuliffe expelled his last trembling breath. There's not as much blood as one would expect, Ben thought. This made sense. The heart had just stopped beating, and blood pressure was dropping precipitously. Not only that, but from the position of the head, most of the blood from the hemorrhaging brain was contained within the skull cavity. Ben shuddered. What the hell was he doing? He'd never killed a man before, and here he was looking at the body with a dispassionate, clinical eye. This was a human being on the floor, and Ben killed him. Death wasn't new to the scientist. He'd killed thousands of animals in his career as an epidemiology researcher, but mainly mice and rats. Never a human being. And yet, as he stood frozen in place, Ben didn't feel remorse for the deed. With his logical mind, he weighed the act against the threat McAuliffe and his boss, the billionaire Eric Monroe, posed to the world. One life to save billions? It was justification enough. Or was it? Yes. Only an hour before, Ben had viewed a terrifying video, showing his RKNMN24 formula in action. 70 innocent people dead. And if that wasn't bad enough, Eric Monroe, the billionaire wunderkind CEO of Monroe Pharmaceuticals, had sat at his desk without a trace of emotion or remorse for what he had done. And then he told Ben that he'd already conducted 2 other, more widespread tests of the bioweapon, each with 100% mortality for those exposed. Monroe said he was pleased with the results. Pleased. That was all the evidence 61-year-old Benjamin Peterson, MD, PhD, needed to conclude that his theory was correct. Eric Monroe was now the most lethal threat in the history of mankind, and he had to be stopped. Still looking dispassionately at the body on the floor, Ben took a moment to collect his thoughts. It was almost 7 p.m. on a Friday evening. No one else was in the research building except for him and the body of Colin McAuliffe. It wouldn't be until Monday before anyone would come looking for them, if even then. That was one of the benefits of Monroe's paranoia. He had compartmentalized everything and reduced the research staff to the bare minimum to keep Ben's work secret. It was also what made Ben's emergency escape plan feasible. He still had time to get away. The meeting a few hours earlier in Monroe's office had been expected, if not the shocking contents of the video that would come later. Eric Monroe, along with his trusted second-in-command, Colin McAuliffe, had called Ben to the 9th floor office of Monroe Pharmaceuticals, a shiny green glass and silver metal building located on the outskirts of Alexandria, Virginia. The meeting was the culmination of pressures that had been building between the billionaire and his lead research scientist. Ben saw it coming and took the appropriate actions should this meeting be the triggering event. "The drug isn't working as before," Monroe stated pointedly. "I don't understand," Ben said, wanting to draw Monroe out. "You know what I'm talking about. I've had my doctors study my cellular makeup." He snorted, seeing Ben's reaction. "Don't act so surprised. You know I have my own doctors checking your work." "I've been doing my own analysis. I see nothing wrong with the formula." "The telomeres are shortening, not growing." "That's to be expected. There's a transition period you're going through. Still, your body is responding better than expected. Far better." "But it's regressing," Monroe countered. "Please, doctor, don't treat me as an imbecile. You should know me better than that by now. You've altered the formula. I want to know why." Why indeed, Ben thought. If only Monroe would understand. Ben had to be careful with the 39-year-old Eric Monroe. He would be hard to deceive. After all, it was Monroe who first envisioned the path to greatly extend human lifespan through the use of an NMN-engineered variant, having done his own research into the subject before tasking Ben with the greatest challenge of his professional career. A mechanical engineer by education, Monroe was a savant who had the ability to absorb vast amounts of information and recall it instantly. Not only that, but he could correlate relationships within divergent data sets that allowed him to combine disciplines, finding solutions across a variety of fields. There was no doubt Monroe was smarter than Ben, but the entrepreneur had changed recently. His mind wasn't functioning the same as when Ben first came to work for him 4 years earlier. His actions now seemed more clouded and distant, less emotional. Ben would call it distracted, but that wasn't right either. It was more like a single-minded focus at the expense of everything else. "I'll check the formula again," Ben finally said. "Maybe I missed something, but I don't think so. This is the 3rd batch I've made for you." Monroe studied Ben, making him nervous. As the seconds passed, Ben felt obligated to fill the silence. "I think we should slow down, Eric. There's still so much we don't know about the effects of NMN-46, about Fortress, the long-term effects. Your recent plateauing is a perfect example of that. Besides, I'm still not sure that what we're doing is morally right." Monroe pushed back in his chair and waved an impatient hand at the scientist. Damn it, Ben, are you going to argue again that extending human lifespan will have damaging effects on the world, on the environment? Of course it will. No one denies that. But there are solutions to that problem. I have something to show you. I think you'll find this interesting. Ben tried to maintain his demeanor. There were events at play here that were testing his mental control. He couldn't let Monroe know how panicked he felt. Desperate for support, the scientist looked at Colin McAuliffe for his reaction. There was none. The man was a sycophant, a devotee of the Church of Eric Monroe. He would follow him to the gates of hell, which, in Ben's opinion, was just where Monroe was leading mankind. Monroe took a remote control from his desk and pressed a button. An inset monitor in the office wall came alive, showing people in full bio-hazmat suits moving along a line of hospital beds, checking the patients and making notes on clipboards. A camera crew was following them, documenting the rounds. All these people, 70 in total, were exposed to the NMN24 formula 8 hours earlier. Monroe narrated the silent video. As you predicted, each has had a complete breakdown in telomere integrity throughout their bodies. Ben wanted to shout out, "Why are you doing this?" But he remained silent. It was part of his professional training. Observe first, react later. With the subjects now susceptible, we introduced a common flu variant, not COVID-19 or any of its mutations, but an older strain, something normally not fatal. The video cut to another angle. It was the same room, but with the video shot at another time, according to the light and shadows in the room. Within another 24 hours, the mortality rate was 100%. Not only that, but most of the subjects also had traces of a dozen other virulent maladies they'd caught on their own, either that had been dormant or was in their genetic makeup, including various cancers. The growth was incredibly fast, almost before our eyes. You were right, Ben. With the complete breakdown of telomeres, none of them could fight off even the most benign illness. This was immunity degradation at the cellular level. For testing purposes, we hastened the process with the flu virus. Ben forced back the bile that was building in his throat. He could feel his heart pounding harder, not only from shock, but from fear. Monroe's emotionless delivery made Ben believe his life was in danger. What would the billionaire do if Ben broke down completely in front of him? But that was pagan. NMN24, Ben managed to say, fighting hard to keep his voice from trembling. What does this have to do with 46? It's all part of the plan. You created my body fortress. Now we have a purpose for it. An antidote for 24? Ben asked anxiously. Was Ben reading this all wrong? Monroe looked over at McAuliffe and laughed. I remember saying that to you once. But no, not an antidote for 24, but a reason for it. Unfortunately, Ben knew what Monroe meant, and that statement had set the events of that fateful Friday evening into motion. Chapter 1. Seattle, Washington, present day. The young black man entered the UPS store on 1st Street, walking with the cocky confidence of a streetwise 17-year-old. He came out less than a minute later, turning right while cinching the black hoodie over his head to protect against the rain and carrying a bulging manila envelope in his hand. He hurried across the street, crossing Columbia before stopping at a green Seattle Times Weekly kiosk. He opened the front and slipped the envelope between a couple of papers while taking a copy out for himself. Afterward, the young man sprinted to the corner of Cherry Street, turned left, and ran across the puddle-covered blacktop before passing through an alley to James Street. He ducked around the corner and into an internet cafe to wait for his contact. Ben Peterson watched the young man make the drop from the 4th level of the Douglas parking facility on 1st Street. This was Ben's 3rd use of a surrogate to collect his mail, and each time the cost escalated. The other 2 times, it was easy to find a kid willing to make a few bucks. But this time, with the frigid and drizzling weather, His options were limited. As it was, approaching a rain-drenched black kid on the street was suspicious in its own right. The young street urchin was named Tyrell, and he sensed Ben's trepidation, demanding $100 for the 20-minute job, suspecting that what he was doing was either illegal or dangerous. Probably both. Ben conceded and paid Tyrell a $50 deposit, with the balance due upon delivery. Ben watched to see if anyone took an interest in the bright green plastic box with the envelope inside. It was raining harder now, with less pedestrian traffic along the street. Even so, a few hardy souls weathered the storm. Seattleites single-handedly supported the umbrella industry on the West Coast. Ben shrugged off the cold and misting rain that swirled through the open concrete structure. The weather wasn't unusual for Seattle this time of year. Hell, any time of the year for that matter. But Ben came prepared, wearing a thick winter coat with a lining and a black watch cap, a habit from his decades on the East Coast. The forecast called for a record-setting cold front moving in off the Pacific, which was one of the reasons he was in the city to collect his mail before the snow moved in. Also, Sunditch should have the results by now. Ben needed that for verification of the third-stage sequencing. The trip into town was worth the risk, if the results were positive. If not, then he had other ideas. He grimaced, thinking how much simpler this would be if he were back at his lab in Alexandria. But that bridge was burned 4 months ago, and in dramatic fashion. Now he had to rely on a good friend to do the testing for him. But if he was right about the formula, the antidote would be within his grasp. Nothing else would matter at that point. He would be able to stop Monroe. If Monroe didn't stop Ben first. The aging scientist was under no illusion that he could spot the surveillance if it were in place. These would be professionals, the best money could buy. They would remain unseen. Even so, the envelope Tyrell placed in the box contained fake mail designed to deceive any watchers. Ben had to make it look convincing, while giving him time to meet the young man for the real pass-off. Ben didn't know if these precautions would work. He was a novice at this. But he was smart, and prided himself on being able to map out every possible scenario. After all, that was his job. Hypothesis and experimentation, both of which involved methodical planning. After 10 minutes of watching the box, and with no one giving it a second glance, Ben left the parking structure, using a gray umbrella to hide his face from traffic cameras. He proceeded along first, before crossing the street to James Ave. He shook off the lingering raindrops from his coat as he entered the internet cafe. Tyrell was sitting on a stool, looking out the water-streaked window at the glistening street. The young man was angry, glancing over his shoulder at the cafe attendant, who eyed him with suspicion. In the future, Ben would have to change the location of the meetup. This looked too much like a drug deal going down. Ben snickered under his breath. In a way, it was.
"It's about fucking time," Tyrell snarled. "That cracker was about to call the cops on me."
"Relax, it's done." Ben produced the second $50 bill, and Tyrell slid the 2-inch thick envelope of mail across the counter, along with his mailbox key.
"You do this a lot?"
Tyrell asked, calmer now that he had an extra $100 in his pocket.
"If you do, I can be your go-to guy. Just hit me up the next time."
"We'll see. Give me your cell number." Tyrell had it ready. He had a damn business card. It read, Tyrell Kramer, all-around stud and gangster. The kid didn't lack in the ego department. Ben took the card and stuffed it into his coat pocket. With the hit-or-miss nature of his recruitment of surrogates, Ben may take Tyrell up on his offer, for as long as he has to keep up the charade. Unfortunately, that part of his life was open-ended, and the longer he stayed missing, the more he felt Monroe and his goons were closing in. Rather than growing more confident with his new way of life, Ben was becoming increasingly nervous and unsure. Tyrell left the internet cafe first, sprinting down the street for cover from the downpour. Ben left a few moments later, crossing the street to another parking structure, where his faded red Ford F-150 pickup was parked. Ben wasn't a pickup kind of guy, but he figured it wouldn't stand out. Not like his BMW. He'd left the luxury vehicle in Virginia, purchasing the pickup from a grizzled grease monkey for cash. It was a miracle the truck made it across the country. As Ben pulled out of the parking structure, he scanned for any unusual activity. He often marveled at how, in the movies, a person would pull away from a parking space, and immediately another car would follow, and no one would notice, not even the professionals. But that was in the movies. This was real life. Although he was anxious to check his mail, Ben drove out of the structure immediately, watching closely for any telltale pursuit. All was quiet. No one followed, as far as he could tell. It was only a quarter-mile to the gates for the Bainbridge Island ferry. Ben followed a steady stream of cars and then stationed his pickup in the left lane, one which would guarantee him a space along the port side of the ferry. What did he think would happen, he wondered? That he'd be detected and have to jump overboard? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he felt more comfortable not crammed into the interior of the boat. He'd timed the mail pickup to coincide with the departure of the ferry, being one of the last cars to be loaded. If anyone followed, they risked missing the boat, literally. And when the lumbering vessel pulled away from the dock, Ben carefully watched the last vehicles that came on after him. There weren't many, and none looked suspicious. As the waters of Puget Sound began to gently rock the ship, Ben relaxed. A leisurely 30-minute cruise to Bainbridge Island, and then another hour to his cabin outside of Port Angeles. He'd done it again, avoided capture. Or worse. At least this time. Chapter 2. With time to kill, Ben checked the stack of mail sitting on the torn cloth passenger seat. He zipped open the envelope, dumping the contents onto the seat. It contained 2 separate bundles of mail, wrapped in rubber bands. Before leaving Virginia, Ben set up mail forwarding service at 2 separate postal outlets. Then, for a fee, the attendants periodically packaged up his mail and sent it to other mailboxes he set up on his trip across the country. The first 2 drops were in St. Louis, where the mail would then be bundled up and sent to an address in Denver. That company sent the business mail directly to Seattle, while forwarding his personal correspondence to Phoenix before sending it to Seattle. The stack of business mail was for Drummond Electronics, the dummy corporation he'd set up to hide his movements. It would include bank and credit card statements and other junk mail, and hopefully an encrypted letter from Sundit Patel, a computer researcher at MIT. Ben had been sending him data sets to run through the Lincoln Laboratory supercomputer on the campus. The last batch Ben sent Sundit was for the final sequencing, the 3rd stage. If it came back positive, then Ben had the answer to his problem. His Eric Monroe problem. The other bundle was his personal mail, forwarded from his home address. This stack of mail had gone through an extra layer of subterfuge to reach him, seeing that it was coming from his house in Arlington. Although he'd read about this technique for mail forwarding in a book, Ben wasn't confident that it would keep him hidden for long. Besides, he didn't know what resources law enforcement would have put in place to track him if they were even looking for him. As far as he could tell from sporadic internet searches, the death of Colin McAuliffe was never made public. Had Monroe hidden the crime so as not to draw attention to Ben and his work? That was a possibility. Ben couldn't reveal the formula to Monroe if he was in prison for murder. And with Monroe's billions, making McAuliffe's body disappear would be easy. That was why Ben went through the elaborate shell game at the Seattle UPS store, on the off chance someone was watching the facility. It was imperative he remain hidden until he was done with his work, if even then. That was also why he had a cabin in the mountains outside Port Angeles, Washington, instead of a place in Seattle. The cabin was 70 miles away, but anyone following his mail would assume the fugitive scientist was in Seattle. They would be wrong. Ben rifled through the stack of Drummond mail. The first letter he noticed was from his storage facility in Silver Spring, Maryland. He grimaced. He knew what it was about. But just below it in the stack was an innocent-looking envelope from Diamond Electronics, the cover Sundit was using in his correspondence with Ben. Tossing the stack of mail into the passenger seat, Ben tore open the letter. It would be in code if anyone opened the envelope and read the contents. Scanning the document, Ben searched for the key phrases. Your order for 19 anode condensers is confirmed. The delivery date will be between the 13th and 24th of the month. These units are of exceptional quality and should fill your needs if run through a TC46 conduit line. However, we also experienced erratic signal readings among the condensers, just as you had noted. The cause is unknown. Ben sat staring at the letter for a full minute, fighting back the tears welling up in his eyes. It was more than he could have hoped for. There was other information hidden in the letter, but what Ben focused on was the confirmation of the 1324 enzyme array on the 19th thread. The T-cell reference was significant as well, but only if the enzyme worked. It did. From here, Ben could synthesize a protein sequence that would produce the desired augmentation of the NMN24, the drug Ben had ominously labeled pagan. This was monumental. For months, even before Ben took flight across the country, he'd been racking his brain for a way to stop Monroe. Now he had it, if only on paper. He would have to find a manufacturing facility to carry his work to the next stage. Or perhaps he would let others do it, maybe the government, if Ben felt the government could be trusted. Eric Monroe was a major donor to both parties, and he traveled in powerful circles. Ben shook off the momentary melancholy. These were details that could be worked out later. Now Ben had to regroup. There were still a few refinements to be made, as evidenced by Sundit's comment about the condenser problem. Ben was aware of this, and already had a solution worked out in his notes. It shouldn't be too hard to overcome. Overall, the letter from Sundit was a godsend, and a vindication of sorts, and for more than the obvious reasons. Dr. Benjamin Peterson, Ph.D., had screwed up. There was no easy way around it. In his rush to perfect the RKNMN drug, he dismissed a serious flaw in the formula that had the opposite effect of what he was trying to achieve. As he tried different protein combinations, one such array caused the telomeres to literally explode rather than regrow, leaving the chromosomes unguarded and susceptible to disease, any disease. This was awful, and with nightmare possibilities if the formula became known. Making a bold note about the variant in his research, Ben filed the formula away and moved on. Only later did he realize how dangerous the formula could be, especially in light of Monroe's erratic behavior. Although the variant wasn't something that would happen through natural mutation, neither was it contagious on its own. It wouldn't be hard to synthesize from the 46 variant. Knowing Monroe, Ben wasn't about to let him have the key to what could become the perfect biological weapon, an efficient killer that could be controlled and delivered in a variety of ways. It was Ben's firm belief that Monroe had gone insane, but not in the traditional manner. The immortality drug had changed him, sending him into an instinctive survival mode, where other humans were seen as a threat. Within the field of genetics and evolutionary biology, this behavior was well known and understood. The movie Lucy popularized it in a speech made by Morgan Freeman at the beginning of the film. It told how when resources are plentiful and the environment welcoming, cells would choose to reproduce. But when there was scarcity and a hostile environment, the cell would choose immortality. Although the present environment for human beings wasn't hostile, Monroe's cells reacted to the introduction of RKNMN46 as if it were. Why else would the telomeres remain strong, protecting chromosomes from natural degradation over time? It was a simple matter of biology reacting to the chemistry, rather than the other way around. This change in personality wasn't something Monroe chose. It happened subconsciously, at the cellular level. And because of that, Ben couldn't trust the billionaire to rein in his primordial fears and desires. He would act on them, without hesitation, without remorse, almost as Ben had done with the death of Colin McAuliffe. But where Ben had taken a single life, he feared Monroe might try to eliminate 6 billion redundant people, as he called them. Would he really? It was a possibility. Monroe may truly react, but based on instinct, not logic. And if he did, he would have RKNMN-24 to carry out the partial genocide, the most massive killing in the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?